Do you still have the same issue?
No, Firefox is working fine.
Oh, okay.
Thank God. Are you ready? Here we go.
Yes, sir.
What's up, everybody? Good morning. Happy Saturday. It is a Saturday morning. That means it's Cafe BTW, a gaming morning podcast. And we're back, and we've been back. We've been back every week, and we've had a lot of guests, and we have a wonderful other guest here today. As you can see here, we got this wonderful man in his studio just chilling. Doesn't have the long hair anymore, but it's Kade from the Gaming Memories podcast. How are you this morning, Kade?
Dude, you had to bring up the hair, didn't you?
I did.
I shove a knife in my heart.
I definitely did.
I'm doing good. If anyone is, I clipped. If anyone out there has long hair and you are peer pressured into cutting your hair, don't fucking do it. Don't listen to them. Don't do it. It's not worth it. Hold your ground. Don't do it, because I feel like I feel like the hair was an amplifier to my true inner self, and I can't turn it up to 11 anymore. I'm all tame and just.
What the hell happened to the hair? I mean, what you're gonna tell me?
Wife
why
wasn't digging it. She got over it. It was.
Oh, it was a
She
wife
liked
move.
it when it was kind of long, but once it was like down to my nipples long, I have really thick hair, and it would just. If I spent a lot of time doing it and managing it, I could get it to a place where it looked okay. But I just sort of let it fly a lot of the time. Just wore a hat.
Let's
It was
see.
too much. It was too much upkeep.
Here it is.
Behold, Elden
When I
Ring.
have a hat on, it's not too bad.
You could see him in his circle, his little circle of Kade there, with his long hair.
Yeah. So I've had a lot of people tell me on the talk that they're bummed about it, because big part of the brand identity was built around that crazy hair. But I'm still going at it. I do regret it, but I'm going to grow it out again. It's going to be a year before it's long. So until then, I am just your quintessential regular white dude.
And that's the end of the podcast. We were just here to talk about Kade's hair. All right. Now, Kade, I love the hair was iconic. I'm not going to lie, but just want to before we get into what you do, obviously I mentioned you're a podcast, so we're going to go back in time because I always start with this first on this show. Okay. What is a memory from your childhood, sir, that kind of you think connected you to your love of video games? Like, what is that particular story? It might be multiple stories, but pick one. What is it about growing up that connected you to video games when you were a kid?
The probably the first chronological memory was I had access to an NES because my older brother had one, and I remember playing Zelda and some other games, but I was really young, like four or five, and it just was a little over my head. But eventually I wanted a Sega Genesis. I think by that time I might have been 7 or 8, and my parents told me I can get one if I saved up $68. I do not remember the price of Sega Genesis at the time. I guarantee it was more than $68. But that was the goal, and so I made a shoebox, and I drew Sega Genesis controllers all over it. I drew the console on it. I drew Sonic on it, and I just saved up my money for close to a year. And I got Sonic 2 as a Christmas gift before I had enough money to get the Genesis. So I would just open the box, look at the pamphlet over and over again. I read the back of the box who knows how many times, thousands of times, just waiting and waiting and waiting. And then when I finally had enough money, we went and got a Sega Genesis, and I threw Sonic 2 in, and it was my first game. Like my console, my game, not someone else's, not a friend's, not my older brother's. And I fell in love with that game. I would already consider myself into video games, which is why I was so excited to save up to get one. But that was the final nail in the coffin. And since then, I've never gotten burnt out on the subject of video games.
Ever.
It's like I've had a subscription to Electronic Gaming Monthly, GamePro, Nintendo
EGM.
Power, EGM, and I still have a lot of them, and it's just never faded. I've had other hobbies that have come and go, and that's why I started the podcast eventually. It was, what's the one thing I've just never got burnt out on? It's gaming. I was constantly following news. I went to E3 a bunch of times, so it's just something that's never faded, so I figured I might as well do something with it.
Yeah, that's cool, man. And I was on your podcast, which I want to talk about. And you have obviously you have a cool setup there, because sometimes I have people jump on here and to Zoom and they don't know anything about audio, but obviously you're a guy that knows his things. But let's talk a little bit about your podcast. I had a great time, by the way, talking to you on the podcast. We kind of shot the shit. You know, got to know each other already, so it's really nice to have you on my podcast. But how did the podcast start? Give us a little 1-2 about what it is, what we can expect from the Gamers Memories podcast. And if you see in chat, if you do !memories, you'll see a link to the link tree for Kade and all of his wonderful media there, so you could check it out.
Yeah.
And welcome Biff, and welcome everyone else that's jumped in chat. Go ahead, Kade. Tell us about this.
The podcast started when I had a business. I got really lucky doing online marketing and building funnels, and I've been pretty much self-employed / half retired for close to a decade. And I had a little scare with a Google algorithm change where a bunch of my traffic dropped significantly for like 2 weeks. And I was worried, like, man, I need to start building some sort of backup plan, some sort of content or some sort of revenue stream. And I was thinking about video games. Like, I never get sick of it. Like, I'm going to start building this. It might take 5 years to get it to somewhere where it's monetizable, but I want to start doing something outside of my traditional online marketing funnels, just because they're so heavily reliant on Google search algorithm, which is prone to change. So that was the initial inspiration. The format is I simply bring on people like you, and I ask them about their favorite gaming memories growing up, similar to your opening question, because I've found that if you can get someone to start talking about some of their most potent nostalgic memories, you become fast friends pretty quick, especially if you're both into video games. It breaks the ice really well. So I focus on bringing on streamers, podcasters. I've had a lot of collectors, a lot of musicians. Before all of this, I ran a record label. I tried to be a rock star for a decade. I have a lot of connections in the music world. I've had visual artists on. I've had crypto people on. I've had you on.
There's us. I found the video. There's
Yep.
us.
Yep. And that was a great clip, by the way. And we salvaged that podcast. Remember,
We did.
I thought
The audio was all
I
messed up.
Yeah, we ended up salvaging it, and I got a lot of help with that. So, yeah, it's been a learning curve. And then the TikTok is what's really.
Yes, tell me about your experience with TikTok.
I'm a big fan. It started because of the pandemic. Normally in the evenings, I train a lot of MMA and jiu-jitsu, and then the pandemic closed everything down. And I had nothing to do, so I just started drinking heavily, like a lot of people during the pandemic, and playing games. And it started out, I would just like a streamer, I would just record my gameplay sessions and then cut up the funny moments when I was drunk and ranting. And I started posting those videos, and they did okay. Then eventually it evolved into the format now, where I pick a game, I write a little script, I highlight it, and it's all centered around my niche. That I'm trying to do is there's lots of good current news. There's lots of good collectors. I focus on retro, indie, and more specifically emulators and mods. That's been my niche, because I felt like that was a niche online, both YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok, that wasn't well served. And I'm naturally into that. I spend more time tinkering with emulators and what I can do with them than sometimes even playing. And so I figured, like, let's just be honest. Like, what am I? I'm into gaming, but what subgenre of gaming am I into? And it's retro and emulation. And I'm not a collector. I don't have a physical collection. There's a lot of guys out there that already have that unlocked. They have massive collections. I'd never catch up. I can't really compete in that regard. Like that. This is a great clip. That's Brutal Doom with a bunch of mods. Project Brutality. So I showcase lots of Doom mods, because the whole world of Doom mods and emulation is awesome. There's so much stuff. And I've probably overall, my most common era that I feature is PS1 era Saturn. That's probably 80% of my videos probably exist in that era of retro. I don't do a lot of 16-bit stuff because I feel, well, one, emulation is pretty limited when it's just sprite work. But once you get to 3D, early 3D, you start having a lot more bells and whistles with emulation.
Yes, and that is the topic today, which I'm excited to kind of dig into a little bit of. I've done a little research on a little brief history on emulation, and then want to talk about the ethics of emulation with you, sir. I want to talk about, the pros and cons, or the controversy, that something I haven't really spoke a ton about on the show. So I feel like you're the perfect guy for this conversation, good or bad, indifferent, whatever it might be. I know you love it, but we're gonna get into that. So the podcast, which I love, I think how I discovered you was TikTok, obviously, and we've had a lot of TikTokers on the show. And I really love the community, but I really love your videos, and I would love for you to do. You always do this famous line about Kojima and Carmack and whatever. Can you do that line for us? That kind of
in the name of Miyamoto the Father, Kojima the Son, and Carmack the Holy Ghost. So the whole spiff is I grew up in what some people would call a cult. I try to be nicer and call it a high demand religion. It's I grew up in Mormonism, like very traditional hardcore Mormonism, and it's,
are you my first Mormon on the show? This is great.
Well,
all right.
I don't know if they claim me now. I'm a dirty I'm an apostate, and I'm going to what is called outer darkness, like the only legitimate hell that a Mormon can go to because I've denied the truth. But that's just me kind of making fun of. So my tagline is the one true video game podcast restored to earth, which is the claim of Mormonism. They think Joseph Smith restored the one true church to earth, right? So I'm just kind of like, my whole spiff is I'm making fun of the idea of a infallible prophet who you can't criticize, and I'll have like really terrible video game opinions, and then just tell people they can't criticize me because I'm the gaming prophet. Too bad. I speak for the gaming gods, which I decided. I think it's Miyamoto the Father, Kojima the Son, and Carmack the Holy Ghost. Those are the three figureheads I decided to make in my make-believe video game religion. That's the Holy Trinity. There's lots of other candidates that could have been part of the Trinity. But
how about no Miyamoto in that line? I mean, he's a Sigourney
Miyamoto.
Mortar.
He's the father.
Oh wait, that's right. You do say Miyamoto. My bad.
Usually I only say in the name of Kojima the Son because in most, at least in Mormonism, when you pray, you mainly just say in the name of Jesus Christ, amen.
Right.
So I say in my pantheon of gaming gods, Kojima is the son. So
Miyamoto the father. My bad. Okay.
Yeah. But TikTok, I'm trying to keep them around 15 to 17 seconds.
And
so, go ahead.
And Carmack, people should know the wonderful legend from id Software who created some of the best engines in the history of first-person shooters. So he should be.
I chose him as the Holy Ghost because in Mormonism, the Holy Ghost is the guy who delivers the message, delivers God's will to the person. And I felt like Carmack creating like the code and the engines that are the base layer of a lot of games and ended up being the inspiration for engines later, even though he didn't have a direct involvement with them. I think he indirectly influenced a lot of the technology in the industry. That is why I chose him as the Holy Ghost in my pantheon of gaming gods.
Yes, and I want to recommend probably one of my favorite gaming-centric books about the history of gaming, and that's Masters of Doom, which really goes in depth about. I don't know, Kate, if you've heard of this book.
I haven't.
Oh my God, you should read this 100%. So this book is about the history of id Software and kind of walks you through what they went through, and it speaks very highly of Carmack and Romero, or whatever, right? That's the other guy. But
John Romero?
Yes. But this is like hardcore like storytelling about what they went through and like, Carmack buying a Next computer remember Steve Jobs got fired by Apple and started Next Computers?
Yes.
And he talks about how he bought a Next computer to actually help him develop the engines for Doom and all that stuff and Wolfenstein or whatever it was. But freaking great book. It goes from them having nothing to having Ferraris in the parking lot. It is, if I could recommend one book in the gaming history side, it is Masters of Doom. Highly recommend this book. So please check it out if you haven't already.
I hate to do this. Can you ramble for a second while I go pee again?
Yes. But yes.
I will go supersonic speed.
Jeez, you are Mr. P.
Bro, because I was worried about, we were talking beforehand.
I know.
I was having a little bit of like I don't know what to call it. Like I don't know, the tightness in the
chest.
actually,
I have some news to share about an event coming up, so I'll talk about that as you go pee.
I will be back. 35 seconds.
35, I'm counting. But yes, I do want to announce just getting some dirty laundry out, and you've probably seen announcements. So, and a lot of you might know this. I know Genzo knows this. And Sanity, shout out to you for the sub for Genzo. Really appreciate it, man. As you know, as many of you might know, I am the gaming community director for Stand Up to Cancer. That's what I do Typically, as someone as a job every day, I work with content creators and streamers like you to raise money and awareness for cancer research. If you look down below, you'll see my dad. There's a photo of my dad on my About Me page. I lost my dad to anaplastic thyroid cancer in 2020. Cancer is very important to me. So we are kicking off, which is our second annual Up to Us, the Stand Up to Cancer event. And basically what this event is, it's the whole month of August this year, kicking off August 1st. And it's just a collaboration between whether you're a live streamer on Twitch, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook. You do a charity stream, you raise money for the collective effort to help us send money to cancer research through Stand Up to Cancer. And it's called Up to Us. If you're interested in signing up, there's going to be a really exciting announcement coming this Wednesday. Wait, that wasn't the link. Let me get it for you. This Wednesday, we're announcing a giveaway for the first 100 streamers to sign up. They're going to be getting something special. It's going to be a limited edition something, and I don't want to tell anyone and give it away just yet because we're going to make the announcement on Wednesday, but you could sign up right now on that Google form. It would mean the world to me if you stream. It doesn't matter if you think you're going to raise $20 or you think you're going to raise $1 million. Which would be amazing. Every bit counts. So if you want to join the Stand Up to Cancer event in August, please let me know. And shout out to Retro Game Brews, who him and I do a Mario Kart charity tournament every August. So we will be talking about that soon. We're going to be kicking that off as Up to Us. That's how I kind of get involved with everything. And yeah, Mikey, thanks for signing up. And Kade, just announcing we're kicking off a cancer research streaming event in August. Called
Sweet.
Up to Us to Stand Up to Cancer. So it's streamers, content creators. You go live and support the cancer research community. So just want to announce all that before we get into the show. But if you have questions about that, please feel free to DM me. I'm happy to help you out. But we're looking for as many people as we can get this year to help us out with this. It's going to be great. But let's get into the topic at hand, Kade.
Let's do it.
And my connection to emulation is a little different. I'm not a big emulator guy, but before we get into,
we'll get you to the dark side. We'll get you there.
You'll get me to the dark side. But as you mentioned, you're someone that doesn't collect games or have a physical collection. But
I did.
You did. Well,
Yes.
where did it go?
I made the ultimate apostate mistake, and during a time of hard financial times, I sold my entire collection. Sort of like cutting my hair, I heavily regret that decision. I probably could have made it work without doing that, but it was a PS1 collection. Wasn't complete, but I would say it was essentially complete of all the best JRPGs, which was my jam back in the day. I think I had probably around 280 titles of PS1.
Man, that
a lot
sucks.
of
You're not alone there, though, man. It's happened. People have to sell.
It's a classic. It's a very common story with collectors that they hit a bad spot and they sell some of their collection. So after I sold that, I didn't have the wherewithal or the motivation to try to get it all back, especially because gaming prices have just skyrocketed. Collectors,
Well, it's just ridiculous right now.
it's ridiculous at this point. So I got into emulation as a way to I still want to play a lot of these old games. I don't own them anymore. But I did buy. So my initial justification was I was playing a lot of the PS1 games I owned previously. And it's I'm not technically emulating a disc I have, but I have bought this before. And I do feel like I own it in this sort of way. But then it just sort of snowballed from there. But that's how I got into it. So I did start collecting. And I still have my PS1. I have a 64. I do want to get a Saturn. I know you love the Saturn. I think they look cool as shit.
The Saturn, from the way it looks, and even when you press the power button, it has a really nice click to it. Just everything about the Saturn is wonderful.
I love the white Saturn.
The Japanese Saturn is really cool too.
Yeah.
So that brings me to, before we get into, I pulled up a little bit of a history of when emulation kind of started for video games, and a lot of it happened in the 90s. That's when it kind of started, because computers necessarily weren't ready for emulation, or they weren't powerful enough for emulation. But first I want to talk about the ethics of it, right? There's been this huge controversy over the years between gamers, and I'll give you my thought first. I obviously am a collector. I have lots of systems. I have the 64, the Dreamcast, I have the Saturn, I have, the TurboGrafx. I got a lot of systems, and I even have a CRT where I can hook it up. But like you said, you sold your collection. Now, I used to be this kind of guy who was like anti-emulation, play it the real way. But I realize more and more that with the way the retro gaming market is, like you said, it really is getting harder and harder for people to say, okay, I can go out and buy physical copies of these things. But I really think that emulation is important to preservation of video games.
Yes.
I think it's very important. And I think as we move into this digital first generation, and the more and more it's going to be more pricey and expensive to get retro games, I think that emulation makes sense. But there's still this huge controversy, and I know where you stand, sort of, but what are your thoughts on the people that are anti-emulation versus the people that are open to emulation? Is there still a huge divide, you think, Kade?
Yeah, I think like any hot topic, there's truth on both sides. Obviously, emulation lends itself to piracy. And I think in the early 90s, that probably hit the bottom line of developers and publishers harder than it hits now. But the flip side is exactly what you said, preservation. There's a few things. One, when it comes to a lot of obscure arcade games, you cannot get them anymore. They don't make the boards. Games that never were released on consoles or had a console port. There's a huge, maybe not huge, but there's a solid amount of games that fit that category where the only way you can preserve them is to run it on an emulator and download some sort of ROM. You cannot, it doesn't matter how much money you have, you're not getting it. The second thing is CD rot is a real thing. Now, cartridges will probably last basically forever, but every disc-based game eventually is going to rot and not be usable anymore. And
Sure.
At some point, they're not going to exist. They're not going to exist. Doesn't matter how much money you have. Doesn't matter what your collection is. They're gone. And so I think preservation is probably the main argument for emulation. Now, obviously, a lot of people like myself are playing a lot of games that they didn't purchase, especially like Saturn games, Japanese versions of games that have fan translations. There's just a lot of stuff you can play that simply aren't realistically accessible. So it's like, okay, technically I'm not like paying for it, but like let's say I buy I've been playing what's this game? It's Blast something on Saturn. It was only Japan that came out with the fan translation. I've done a few videos on it. The name is escaping me, but there is no one left to make money off that game. The developers are gone, the company's gone, the publishers are gone. Saturn, like, it doesn't feel like I'm stealing because there's no one to pay. Like there's no official channel to go through to play that game the official right way.
That's a good point, actually. There are many games, even games that came out in the 80s and 90s, that studios closed down, no longer exist. So there's, and don't even get me started on this announcement on the Last of Us remake that just got announced. I don't even want to talk about that. I have so many reasons why that is the most silliest thing I've ever heard. All right, I'll tell you real quick on that. But okay, no, I don't want to talk about that. No, that's just like, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole. But I think that there are still obviously developers and companies that do own the copyrights, Kade, and that is something also that's still going on. But it's kind of like music downloading where there's just nothing people can do anymore. No one goes to jail for downloading music. No one goes to jail for downloading emulators. So it's almost like a look the other way thing from a corporate perspective. But back in the early days of emulation, Sony sued an emulator, which we'll talk about. Nintendo tried to sue a few of them as well. But it's kind of like, what do you think of the idea that emulation exists all over the place right now? But I think the studios today just look the other way, and there's nothing they can really do anymore. Like, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think the only area where I think it's legitimately a little gray is like there's already a good Switch emulator. There's a decent Switch emulator right now, and you can play you can play Metroid Jet in unlocked frame rate native 4K, and arguably that's a better experience than the native version. And I would say that could potentially legitimately hurt the developers and the sales. But when the farther back in time you go, the less of a problem I personally have with emulation, and I think it becomes less gray and more preservation. And again, as I said, a lot of these titles you want to play, there's really no good official way to play them. And I have a whole series on my TikTok about DIY remastering, especially with 3D games. You talked about PS1 and Sony. A lot of PS1 emulation now is to the point where you can fix texture warble, you can fix texture breaking, you can unlock the frame rates, you can render at native 4K, and now you can do texture swaps, meaning people can extract the textures, upscale them using AI, or replace them with handmade textures and inject them back in the game. And the community essentially creates remasters for games you're never going to get a remaster for. And so it's one of those like, I'm torn. Like, there's a Legend of Dragoon upscale project right now. It's a classic JRPG that a lot of people love.
Sure.
People are extracting all the backgrounds, running them through AI upscalers, and then injecting them back in the game. We'll probably never get a proper Legend of Dragoon re-release or remaster. So it's one of those, again, gray areas. Like, Sony's not doing anything about it, and I don't think they can, because from what I understand, the language of fair use, as long as you're doing something as a fan and not selling it and trying to make money, then it's sort of free game.
That's true. Let me read some comments here because I had some good. Retro Game Brew says, emulation is important to me because running contests and tournaments would be impossible without it. And yes, Al says, good morning, I got donuts. Welcome, Al. Retro Game Brew says, the only people get sued are people trying to sell ROMs. Al says, doing good, blah, blah, blah. Good to see you, Al. And Mikey says, Legend of Dragoon is sexy. Retro Game Brew says, the Wolfenstein Home Improvement Homebrew is the greatest thing I've ever seen.
Have you seen Retro Game Brews? There's a Brutal Doom is a mod for Doom, which gives it modern gameplay. Brutal Wolfenstein has been created. I did a video on it and did really, really well. If you're into Wolfenstein, old school Wolfenstein 3D, look up Zion McCall's Brutal Wolfenstein. You will be very pleased.
Yes, and I have a funny comment from Biff who says, I'm still waiting for the Zork 4K Ultra Remaster, which the funny story there, Zork, I believe, is the MUD, multi-user dungeon, text-based adventure. So one day we'll see a 4K of Zork. Now let's talk a little bit about history. So I digged a little bit, Kade, and I always say this on the podcast, I am no way, shape, or form historian, but I do research. So take everything I say here with a grain of salt. But I was trying to figure out, when did emulation start? When did people start emulating things? Now, one interesting thing that came out, the Commodore released something called the emulator back in the
BBC base
early 90s. And what it was a way for kids to learn code, basic code. So this was like a public software released by Commodore to allow kids, or basically to educate kids on basic and how to do coding. And this is a very early entrance to emulating, or being able to create and emulate games through a computer. Now remember, this time you didn't really have console games being emulated yet, and there was just a lot of basic software to allow people to do coding. But what's interesting is they actually called it the emulator. And later, as things evolved, people started posting emulator discs in newspapers and magazines to sell them. And you would buy them from people literally through the mail, and they would send you discs of PC games, not console yet. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then the Amiga and the Atari ST were very involved in early emulation as well, because these computers started to have a little bit more graphic power in order to emulate games. Then moving on, one of the first and most popular NES emulators was called Nesticle. Have you ever heard of the Nesticle emulator?
I do know the Nesticle. Everything else I've never heard of, but I have heard of Nesticle.
So Nesticle was one of the early Nintendo Entertainment System emulators, and this was the first time that PC players were getting an opportunity to play these NES titles on their computer. So Nesticle was a very popular, I know it's such a funny name too. It's such a 90s like software name too. I always felt like the 90s computer names and weird things, there was always like just funny names like, but Nesticle was kind of an entrance into it. And then Genesis Mega Drive, we saw emulator came out for DOS called Gen M. I don't know if you've heard of this one. This was a Mega Drive emulator, which obviously played Genesis games. And then moving on, as the PlayStation was released, there was another emulator called the PSEMU, which was ability to emulate PlayStation games. So things started to spiral, Cade, where emulators were being released, people were able to emulate things, and then the internet made it more accessible, where people were posting downloadable links in the mid to late 90s, and you were able to actually download games to your computer, and emulation kind of spiraled from there. But we must talk about one of the most famous emulators ever made, which was MAME. I'm sure you know MAME. Brought the arcade to the computer, right? The arcade was something that wasn't emulated yet, and then MAME came into the fold and became, today is still around. And what is your connection to MAME? Are you a big MAME person? Have you used MAME?
Yes, and I would say the biggest reason I played MAME is I don't know if I would call it a framework or an engine, but there's a term called Mugen, M-U-G-E-N, which I do not know what it stands for. I think it's an acronym, but it's an engine that like emulates, or it's a rip of a fighting game engine. And basically with Mugen mods in MAME, you can play every fighting game combination you'd ever want. And there's these massive Mugen mods you can download that have like every character from Street Fighter, from every game, every character from Mortal Kombat, like they put them all together. And there's an insane world of just what is called Mugen mods. And
Interesting.
It's parallel to MAME. It runs on MAME sometimes. Some of them are standalone. But I played a lot of MAME, and Mugen I got way into because there's just like, if you wanted to play, like for example, there's one where you can play Lara Croft versus Johnny Cage, or you can play all the Dragon Ball Z characters from every Dragon Ball Z sprite-based video game to. I'm like, there's so much I'm having a hard time thinking about what to say, other than just imagine a framework where you can play any character from any 2D based fighting game with any other character. Plus, the community has made 2D versions of a bunch of characters that were never released officially in any sort of video game, like Lara Croft. Like Lara Croft has never had a 2D game that I'm aware of. But you can download a pack with move sets and controls and everything all made, and put Lara Croft into your fighting game. And her fatality is she smashes people between her boobs. Of course, this is what happens. So I think Mugen is a pretty big community. I haven't been involved in the Mugen community for a long time. I think it's still going though.
Interesting. Let's see. We got Al says, I'd love to see a remaster of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers game from this NES, preferably the version based on the 1995 film. Retro Game says, Play Cable for the Intellivision was essentially an emulator. You could download games from your cable TV line and play in the 1980s. Yeah, but it was still through Intellivision, and it wasn't being emulated by a third party. So Intellivision, I think, was working with Play Cable and giving them the copyright rights to that. But essentially, yes, Retro Game Reviews, that was an emulator. Mikey says, without emulation, it would be very hard for me to get into speed running of games. The fact that there are save states in emulations made learning games easier. Al says, as much as I'd love to get an emulated version of the MMPR movie NES, Nintendo seems to be very threatened about stuff, and the physical copy seems to be increasing in value. Here's one. There's an emulator. Have you ever heard of Bleem?
Yes.
So Bleem was a Sony PlayStation emulator and Dreamcast emulator, and this is the first instance that a company like Sony's tried to sue them. So here's what the judge says when Sony took Bleem to court, and the judge rejected the notion and issued a protective order to protect David from Goliath. Sony's second copyright allegation regarded the use of screenshots of their advertisements comparing the native PlayStation emulated to Bleem versions. So Bleem was using actual photos of the games, and this judge literally said, in essence, gave Bleem the win here and said that it was all an act of fair use, like you mentioned earlier. Even using the actual cover art was rejected Sony. So Sony lost this, but guess what? Bleem went under anyway because of all the legal fees they spent trying to defend themselves. So they actually went under.
But they set the precedent that essentially, as long as you're not selling your emulator, you're not selling ROMs.
Yep.
It's all fair use.
Exactly. And then have you heard of Ultra HLE, which was apparently a very popular early Nintendo 64 emulator?
No, I
So
have not.
these are all early emulators. It's a discontinued emulator for the Nintendo 64 currently, but it was released in 1999 and was able to emulate N64 games. So what's the difference in your eyes of this whole, and this is something that you focus on, is the upconverting of games, right?
Yes. Before I get into that, can I take another bathroom break? I'm sorry. I drink a gallon of
You
water.
are the first person to pee more than once on the show.
Dude, I told you, yeah, I drank a gallon of water because I thought some of my issues might be dehydration related.
Go ahead.
And
I got this. I got this. I'm a host for a reason.
And I was gonna go into it, but I'm like, this is an area where I can talk for a while, so I need, yeah.
All right,
35 seconds again.
You got it. I'll talk to my friends in chat. But yeah, I do want to say that, I used to hate emulation so much. I used to be so anti-emulation, but I understand it now, and I think that it's important going forward. And I know that a lot of people are still anti-emulation, but he's going for the record here. I think he's the only one to be. Exactly, Genzo. He is the only one to ever pee on the show. I think so, and he's peed 3 times now, or twice. So everyone on VOD, this is our first time we've seen a peer. So congratulations, Kade, on being the first one to pee on our show. Pro gamers have pee bottles, just saying. Can we hit a third? Can we get a third in? Oh, man. I am, that's really funny. But back to emulation. I still love playing things the way they were meant to be. I am nowhere near ever been a person that plays modded stuff. I don't have EverDrives, and I will continue to probably not be a person that emulates. And it's not because I hate emulation. It's just because I have access to games right here in my house. I'm very lucky to have a good collection of stuff. Last night we were playing Seaman on the Dreamcast. That was awesome with the microphone, and I'm actually going to start playing that as a series on TikTok. We also played Shenmue. I started replaying that. So, yeah. So here he is. Kade, you are actually, once he gets back, I gotta tell. Oh, you are the first person to pee on the show, apparently.
Oh, did my camera freeze? Because they can't see me.
Yeah, I don't see you. You're like a mystical voice now. Let me look at the Zoom.
Yeah, I'm like
Yeah, you're frozen, man.
I can't stop the video. There we go.
There we go. Try again. There you go.
I'm back.
Okay, there you are.
He lives. All right. So upscaling, upconverting. I can talk about this all day. How much time we got?
We got 15 minutes, sir.
Okay. When it comes to 8-bit or pre-8, like Atari, all that stuff, there's not a lot of options. Once you get to NES, there is an emulator called Mesen, M-E-S-E-N. There's 2 ways to upscale. I love that you're showing Mega Man Legends because I have a specific formula for that, for those 2 games. Anyway, we'll get to that. With 8-bit games, starting with the Nintendo era, you have 2 options for upscaling and sort of putting a fresh coat of paint over sprites. You have AI upscaling algorithms that are like HQ2X, MMMX, 2X, 4X, 8X, and they basically use the same technology as like an AI upscaling algorithm like Topaz or Earthscan, but apply that to the sprites in real time, and to be quite frank, they look like shit. I don't like them. They very rarely look good. But Mesen is an emulator for the NES that allows you to swap any asset in a Nintendo game and make it up to 4 times higher resolution. And of course, the community has delivered on all the big games: Mario, Zelda, Contra, Punch-Out, yada, yada, yada. That's really the only option when it comes to pre or 16-bit or lower. When it's purely sprite-based games, you basically only have filters you can apply, or ROM hacks, which can change the gameplay. Like there's ROM hacks famously for Streets of Rage 2, where you can play the Turtles, or they import people from different fighting games into Streets of Rage or Final Fight, or put them together. There's lots of gameplay related stuff and asset related stuff, but as far as upscaling, if it's purely sprite based, the options are very limited. You either swap the sprites out completely or you use some sort of filter. Once you get to 3D, like Ocarina of Time, any PlayStation game, Mega Man Legends, these modern day emulators, because it's the 3D geometry is vector based, so you can render that at any resolution that your rig can support or that the emulator can support. So you can run these games at native 4K. In fact, I run my PS1 games at 12K, even though they're only displayed in 4K because it makes things really, really, really sharp. That's the geometry. Now you still have the original textures, which again you can use scaling algorithms, blurring algorithms, bilinear, trilinear, etc., etc., etc. Burning Rangers is another great game.
A
But
game that's becoming you know how much this goes for now, the
oh my
American
God,
version? It's like
it's
$800 now. It's
yes.
ridiculous. A great game though. And by the way, it's made by Sonic Team if people didn't know that. And they were, you know, the people that made the original Sonic and everything. Sonic Team made Burning Rangers, just so people know that.
And Burning Rangers is a great example. So Saturn emulation has recently hit a new milestone where it previously was pretty finicky, but there's an emulator called Yaba Shanshiro. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but it has what PS1 has had for a long time. It has what's called PGXP. I think it stands for Precision Geometry Transform Pipeline. I do not know what that means, but in layman's term, it fixes all the wobbliness that PS1 and Saturn games had, where textures would break, geometry would kind of wobble and clip with each other. And you can run the game in native 4K, and you can unlock the frame rates. Now, the problem with unlocking frame rates, a lot of time game logic is tied to frames. So sometimes if you use an emulator, like I want to play this game in 60 frames a second, all of a sudden you start falling through walls and clipping through stuff. But Burning Rangers is one that works. I've working on footage of playing that game in 4K 60 FPS, and it's glorious. The combination of all those things together, I feel like, is the holy grail when it comes to emulation. For example, Mega Man Legends, same thing. You can run it in 4K. You can upscale the textures, and that particular art style works really well with upscaling because it's cel shaded and it's not photorealistic, and it's fairly simple. And then you can add a cel shaded real time filter with emulation, so it gives it a cel shaded look with like the dark lines. And then you can interpolate it to 60 frames a second. I have done a few videos of that on my TikTok. They're pretty old, but that's what I would call a DIY remaster. Once you hit
DIY
3D
remaster.
Once you hit the 32-bit era with emulation, you can essentially, and then plus with save states, ROM hacks, gameplay stuff, you can, depending on how much effort the community has put into an individual game. If it's obviously really popular games, you're going to have more options and more texture options and more hack options than obscure games. But there's a lot of games like Mega Man Legends 1 and 2, which I played through recently, that really feel like what a proper remaster would be if they ever did that. It's modern controls, save states, 60 frames a second, 4K. Ocarina of Time is one of the most, what's the word?
Upscaled.
Yeah, like your options you have for Ocarina of Time are endless. There's a like a Wind Waker. That's the Citra version, the 3DS remake, which they upscaled all the original textures with AI upscaling, so it's faithful to the original look. There's also a texture pack for N64. I think it's called Lulu's Textures Pack. It makes it look like cel-shaded Wind Waker. You can play Ocarina of Time all the way through in the style of Wind Waker graphics. Project 64 is a 64 emulator, and the Citra emulator for 3DS have had texture swapping support for like a decade. So there's a lot of projects. PS1 just barely got it like last year. Emulation finally got texture swapping. But 64 games and Wii games and GameCube games with the Dolphin emulator have had it for years. So those consoles, you have a ton of options. Like Metroid Prime has a ton of options, Twilight Princess, Wind Waker, all the big Nintendo franchises, Mario Kart. There's an awesome Mario Kart 64 HD mod. It's the rabbit hole goes deep.
That's really cool. I mean, that's something that I always found fascinating about the stuff you're doing, because you talk a lot about emulation, but you're talking about the upscaling. And it's interesting about the Saturn, because the Saturn is becoming more and more of a system that you just can't get your hands on anymore. And it's really interesting. I want to see the Burning Rangers one. That sounds really cool.
I will get you some footage.
You got to get me some footage, because it's one of my favorite Saturn games, without a doubt. And you said Panzer Dragoon Saga as well is getting upscale emulation as well.
Well, so Saturn, as far as I know, unless something has changed in the last like 4 or 5 months, does not support texture swapping. I mean, you can't extract the textures, upscale them, and put them back in, but you can upscale the internal resolution of the game to 4K. So you get really sharp geometry, but the textures still are the original textures of the game, which sometimes looks really, really good. I don't. There are filters you can put onto the original textures that make them look more like, specifically bilinear is a very common filter. That's what Nintendo 64 used and PlayStation 2 used to filter their textures. So it gives it that sort of blurred, really smooth look. I don't think that looks good on a lot of older PS1 Saturn games, so I do what is called nearest, which leaves the texture untouched but just scales it natively to look the same at 4K, so you still see the pixels. Because I think that pixel blocky look can look good depending on the art direction of the game. So that's how I play Panzer Dragoon Saga. It runs at 60 frames on emulator, and it runs at native 4K, but I leave the textures untouched. If there was the option to swap textures and someone in the community had done it, I would obviously play it that way. And I'm sure at some point, when Saturn emulation is, from what I understand, the Sega Saturn is an extremely complicated architecture. And
it was very hard to program for. That's
Yes.
why some of the best games on the Sega Saturn are the ones developed by Sega themselves, because they kind of understood it. But it was very difficult to program for, and that's why a lot of third-party games weren't that great, or they had problems programming and releasing games. But that's because it was kind of ahead of its time. But that's why all the great games on the system were made by Sega, like Burning Rangers and Nights into Dreams and Panzer Dragoon. Like all the heavy hitters.
Guardian Heroes was pretty big. Who made Guardian Heroes?
Guardian Heroes was actually, I don't think it was Sega. It might have been, but actually, funny you mentioned that. 1 second.
You posted a picture of it recently. I think you have a copy. Yeah. Mikey loves retro. While he's getting that, my favorite emulator is probably... oh, sorry.
I pulled it out of the depths of my bins, but here it is. We could look at it. I could tell you who
there
actually...
it is, baby.
Here it is.
The OG.
This is the real deal here.
Not the Xbox 360 re-release
No,
bullshit. That's the real deal.
It's the real one. This one was developed, but it's a good question. I actually don't know. It was a Sega Saturn exclusive,
Definitely.
which is awesome. Who did develop this game? I'll have to look it up. I actually don't know that answer.
Anyway, that's one of the biggest. That's one of the reasons I got into Saturn emulation. I wanted to play that game so bad. I remember reading
It's so
about
good.
it
It's one of the
when it
best
came
beat 'em
out.
up games ever made.
Yeah,
Without a
everyone
doubt.
says it's the bomb.
So Treasure Video Games created it, who's someone I'm not very familiar with. They were a Japanese video game developer based in Tokyo, known for action platformers. And it had a lot of former Konami employees.
Interesting.
So that's interesting. And that's a good example of a game that wasn't developed by Sega that was fantastic on. And it is very pricey these days. I'm lucky that I have it here.
So I played you can emulate 360, and I downloaded the 360 Xbox Live arcade re-release of that game and played it, and it was they used what I was talking about, these filters that you can run on sprites. They didn't properly upscale it. They just applied these filters to the sprites, and I think sprite work looks terrible, especially low resolution sprite work with these filters. So then I'm like, I'm gonna basically emulate the original because I think it looks better. And I know it won't have some of the quality of life improvements that the Xbox Live re-release has, but I couldn't stand the aesthetic of the 360 version.
Quick question for you from our chat, Kade. What is your favorite? And shout out to Younglings. What's up? Good to see you in chat. Mikey, Younglings is a mod in our Twitter retro gaming community, which we started, and she's awesome. Mikey says, "What is your favorite emulator, Kade, and why?"
Probably DuckStation. It's a PS1 emulator, or Beetle HW. They're both PS1 emulators, about exactly the same in functionality, but DuckStation is so I like Beetle HW because it's part of RetroArch, which is like an all-in-one emulator platform. It emulates almost everything. Their version of PlayStation 1 emulator is called Beetle HW, which is decent, but DuckStation is slightly better. The only downside is it's not part of RetroArch. It's not part of an all-in-one solution. But DuckStation, like I said, you can run PS1 games at 12 to 18x the native resolution. So we're talking like 18, 12K. And most computers, I love that meme because EPSXE is what I used to play. And then DuckStation came along and just fucked EPSXE in the ass.
Right.
Like It's too bad because I was an EPSXE like follower for years, like a decade. That's what I emulated with. But DuckStation is the shit. If you're into PS1 games, it supports PGXP, so it fixes texture warble, texture breaking, all that stuff. Native 4K up to 12K rendering, and then now it supports texture swapping, meaning people can extract textures and then replace them with custom textures or upscale textures. So, for example, I am playing through Xenogears right now, which has a bunch of background textures that have been upscaled. PS1 texture replacement is new, and it's going to take time for the community to come up, but there are a handful of games that people are working on. Like I did a video on Legend of Dragoon recently. They're about halfway through that game. Final Fantasy VII obviously has a lot of stuff. The original Resident Evils on PlayStation 1, Resident Evil 1 and 2 that have those old school like pre-rendered backgrounds actually do pretty well if you upscale them. People are working on that. So I would say DuckStation is where to go. And DuckStation has ability to play around with frame rates. Like I said, sometimes unlocking the frame rate or playing at 60 frames can break the game's logic, depending. Like, for example, Gran Turismo 2 is a game that is graphical powerhouse on the PS1, and I wanted to play it on DuckStation to see like how far we could push it. But when you play that game at 60 FPS, all the AI of the other car breaks. Like they're tied to frame logic somehow, and you start clipping through walls and falling through the track. So there are some games it's not ready to play at 60 frames a second, but a lot of people are releasing hacks. So like you can download a hack and then it'll fix that. So it's PS1 just barely got texture replacement, while 64, GameCube, Dolphin have had it for probably close to a decade.
That's cool. Amazing. And yeah, I'll have to check out DuckStation myself. That being said, before we go, I have one final question for you, Kade, but this morning, and usually what I do before I do a podcast, I think about what topic we're talking about, and I ask the world what they think. So we had a really good response on my tweet this morning. Do you love, hate, or indifferent on video game emulation? So I'm going to read a few comments here. Duck in Disguise says, love it. There are so many older games that simply can't be played in other way, in many ways. Privacy sucks, but emulation is necessary. And Commodore Chronicles podcast, who was in chat earlier, said, I'm going to lean towards love. Though I do still think OG hardware is the best experience, it can be fickle and unreliable. Unfortunately, vintage now has a high cost, and emulation places the classics in everyone's hands. Retro Set Joe said, emulation is important for the sake of preservation, like I had mentioned. I prefer to play on a real hardware, and I'm blessed to have that opportunity. I will emulate if I have it, but if I can't afford it, then I'm going to emulate. Commissioner says, I'm indifferent. I love physical copies, but playing X-Men, Ninja Turtles, and The Simpsons arcade on emulator is pretty dope. If anyone successfully added those 3 games to an iPad, please let me know. James says, if emulation didn't exist, there are so many expensive titles people would not be able to experience otherwise. Fan translation patches and the pros are never ending. Marcelo says, love it. Emulation is very important. I'll read a few more here. Someone just commented indifferent with no explanation. Well, thanks to emulation, I was able to get into the Persona and Fire Emblem series and became who I am today from it. Honestly, while I don't openly support emulation, sometimes I think it's okay for older games for people who are flat broke. But some games are harder to emulate than others. And finally, one more I'll read is AMP. I love it. Emulators over S-Video look nice, especially NES, which my console tops out at composite. Depends what I'm feeling and which TV I want to play on. Lots of original hardware on tap. And if anyone wants to read a lot of these comments, we had a lot of reaction to this tweet today, so you could check it out right here and see what other people are commenting. Oh, Mikey, I saw you posted. I love emulation as long as people are not using it to sell games for profit. If you're using it for personal use or to sell how to play something new, also with game prices being so expensive and rare, it makes it hard to find. What do you think of those comments, Kade? Pretty on the nose.
I agree with almost all of them. The only thing I would push out, also shout out to Mikey Loves Retro. I know Mikey. He's a good dude. I've seen him around on the old interwebs. I agree with basically all of those. The only thing I would push back on is people who say the experience on original hardware is better. It can be. It comes down to 2 things. One, if you are what I call part of the CRT religion, which I think you're
Hello, me.
yes,
I have a
I think-
CRT right behind. I don't know if you could see it, but behind
yeah,
Deadpool, there's a
there
CRT.
is a certain visual aesthetic that cannot be replicated unless you have an actual CRT. I like it. I don't love that aesthetic enough for me to ruin emulation. And then there are really good filters that most emulators have that can get pretty close. It's not the same, but it's 80% there if you love that look. But I would say someone mentioned about speedrunning earlier and save states.
Yep.
I would say that combined with the ability to control the speed of the game, fast forward and rewind. When you play a lot of, like, say you play a new Final Fantasy 12 re-release, the Zodiac version on PC, what did they add to it? They added save states. They added fast forward. They added rewind to make the grinding and to give it modern day quality of life improvements. You can do that already on emulation. I love to play, like right now I'm playing Onimusha Dawn of Dreams, which is my favorite game in the series. A lot of people don't talk about it. It's the fourth and last game besides the fighting game in Onimusha. It runs just a tad slow. I play it at 125% speed. Just give it a little bit, 25% boost, and it feels like a super snappy modern game. Plus I have save states, plus I have rewind, and it's I would argue functionally it's a better experience than playing it on original hardware. The only counter argument would be aesthetically, if that CRT look is, top of your priority list, then
Ooh, let me
then
tell
it is
you,
what it is.
those Saturn games on my CRT are beautiful, man. I'm lucky. I have a CRT behind us. I play original hardware on a CRT. It is disgusting seeing retro gaming on an LCD. It's the worst, ugliest look I've ever seen. I can't deal with it. So personally, I have all my games available to me. Like I was playing Seaman on the Dreamcast through CRT yesterday, and it was fantastic. Played Crazy Taxi the other day. So you're right, but if you don't have a CRT, then I get it. That said, Kade, one final question before we go, and it's been awesome, man. Thanks for coming on the show. I know offline, you weren't feeling so good, so really, really made it through, and you peed twice on the show.
Yeah.
Really happy
I drank
about that.
a gallon of water to hopefully make myself feel better, so I'm sorry about the double piss break.
It's okay. Final question. What is the future of emulation going forward, you think?
I think it's going to continue to exist in that fair use gray area. There'll probably be more scandals or sites that are trying to sell emulators. There's that weird Chinese, like Asian, maybe third world country market where they sell these like Retron consoles that have a bunch of everything. Like, that will probably stay the same. I think it's going to keep getting better and better. I think that the tools and the ability to change games to play them in a fresh experience, whether it's ROM hacks, community mods. Like, for example, there's a great ROM hack on emulator called Star Fox Conquest that's being developed. It completely changes Ocarina of Time to be a Star Fox Adventures game, but on the N64. It's using the code of Ocarina of Time. They're rewriting it, and their goal is to actually make it playable on a native N64. But the reality is almost everyone's going to play it on emulator because that's just the reality of it. I think stuff like that is going to continue to happen, and the options for emulators are going to get better and better and better, and the way that you can tweak games is going to get better and better and better. And I think eventually it's going to become, again, outside of the CRT aesthetic, I think the options and the quality of life stuff that are accessible through emulation is going to continue to make it be more popular, because coincided with, as everyone keeps mentioning, the barrier to entry cost-wise to retro gaming is only going to keep going up.
It's not going to, everyone asks, is the market going to crash? I actually don't think it will. I think value's going to stick as long as we keep pushing into a digital age and less tangible games are created. They're just going to be more valuable than ever. Dude, Kade, I was in some Hobunk town a while ago, and I saw an antique store, and I went into an antique store, not a retro gaming store, and there it was, a case full of retro games in an antique store. That scares me in a sense that shows me how old I am now. But that's kind of where we're going, like antique stores. And one day, Kade, retro gaming stores will not survive as much as they are today, because games are going to become so valuable, so expensive. It's going to be different. And
when that disc, also, I didn't learn about this till like a year ago. but this idea I didn't know was real is disc rot. There's nothing you can do about almost any DVD, almost any CD that's ever been made is going to eventually decay and be unusable. It's going to take like 60 years, 50 years. But all that's like discs are not going to last forever. Cartridges, as long as they're well taken care of, should last in theory a really,
I think
really
so.
long time.
Yeah, I think
But
so.
those discs are going to disappear. The supply is limited. The demand is only going to go up, which means the price is only going to go up. And I think emulation is going to be more and more the most accessible way to
Dude.
get to stuff.
A good example is this Guardian Heroes case. The case alone, without the goddamn game, is worth like $150. Just the freaking case.
That's crazy.
And this is a game from my collection. Like, I've had it for years, and it's in good shape. But just the freaking box, and then the instruction manual alone is worth $100. And then the game together. So together, the game is worth $400 practically. People are paying $300 for boxes, Kade. Not even the games. That's what's
Yeah.
crazy to me.
I wanted to bring up Retro Game Brews mentioned emulation fixed the slowdown you see in PAL region games.
Yes.
Yes, that happens with both PS1 and Saturn games. You can basically set it to whatever region you want, and then obviously with speed modifiers, you can fix all of that stuff. Again, I think what we'll probably see is more official channels embracing emulation as retro gaming becomes more unaccessible. I think you're going to see more retro console releases, more virtual. Obviously, the Switch is doing stuff with
They're
SNES.
selling nostalgia. Like, even the big
Yes.
brands are selling their own nostalgia now. You know, the minis and whatnot. And Genesis or Sega just announced the Mega Drive Mini 2 in Japan.
I was going to ask about that. Does that have more games than the original Mega Drive?
It's going to have like Sega CD games, I think, and a bunch of like all new games. Yeah, it's like a whole updated thing.
So my question for that is obviously I see a lot of people when these retro consoles come out, the official ones, they hack them and then they put all the extra games that aren't on the console. What I don't like about the official channels for emulation is the same model is going to happen. They're going to slowly give us what we want over time and extract as much money, which you can't really blame them. Their job as a company is to make money. But I know it's possible for them to release a Mega Drive mini console with everything on it right now. But no, they do the 1 with 30 games, and they come out with the 2 with 50 games. And when really we just want the original experience with all the games, and we can get it online for free without the cool little retro piece of hardware. So I wish they would. Yeah, it bothers me a little bit.
Then there's rumors of a mini Dreamcast. I'd love to see a mini Saturn. That would be really cool.
Oh my god, I'd probably buy that one.
But yeah, Kade, this has been amazing. I do have to kind of hit us towards the end here because we like to keep the show concise, about an hour. We went a little over, and I'm going to blame your pee breaks for that.
Guilty as charged.
But dude, before we go, where can we find you? What can we look forward to in your new podcast coming out? All that fun stuff about you.
All right, so the actual podcast is on all of the standard podcast platforms, Spotify, etc. Just search Gaming Memories. The format of that is I bring people on like yourself. I get to know them by asking them about the games they played growing up. Most guests are some sort of creative, so podcaster, streamer, musician, artist, author, etc.
You consider me an artist? Thanks, Kade.
You're a content creator, for
I
sure.
know, I'm just kidding.
Which
I guess
some
I'm an
people
artist.
Some people think that's a dirty word. I don't think it's a dirty word.
No, it's not a dirty word at all. I like it.
My TikTok is where I post like clips of things that I'm messing with. So emulators that I'm messing with. I pretty much highlight retro games and cool things you can do with emulation. Lots of upscaling, lots of ROM hacks. Like getting ray traced lighting in the original Doom or Legend of Dragoon Upscale, which you're playing right now. All those, it's just lots and lots of that stuff. There's that Star Fox Conquest game I was talking about earlier, which is that N64 recoding. There's the Legend of Dragoon Upscale project. But that's my TikTok, Gaming Memories Pod on there. Instagram is the same content. And then I am working on a YouTube channel of deeper content where I go into tutorials and more deeper footage. Like right now, I finished all of the bosses in Final Fantasy VIII. with all the best PC mods, upscaling mods, interpolated to 60 frames a second. It's about an hour and 15 minutes, and I'm uploading it to YouTube as a deeper. If you want to see what Final Fantasy VIII can look like with all the best bells and whistles without going through the trouble of spending 6 hours modding it yourself, that's what I want my YouTube channel to be.
I love it, man. I think you're awesome. I think I discovered you. You're part of like the kind of early TikTok crew of gamers and retro gamers. We discovered each other a long time ago.
Yes.
So yeah, please check out his podcast. There is an episode with us if you want to hear more of us jibber jabbering, because I know you loved hearing us talk and Kade peeing.
I don't think you were that long ago. I think you're probably
very recently.
Yeah, not that you're probably only a few episodes back.
Yeah, cool. So, Kade, awesome. Just going to let everyone know one big thing. I know you're not on Twitter, Kade, but we do have a retro gaming community on Twitter, and I wanted to share the link. If you are on Twitter and you're not a part of our retro gaming community, Kade, we have over over 1,200 members now that have joined the retro gaming community. It's a safe place for you to share your love of retro gaming. If you don't want to share your pickups on your main feed on Twitter, come into the group, share them there, and you know that it's going to be spread around a bunch of people that really love it. Also, Kade, today, once I finish the podcast, I'm announcing the winner of our Final Fight NES giveaway within the community. We do giveaways for milestones and announcements and whatnot, and I'm giving away, and this is my gift to the community, I'm giving away a copy of Final Fight for the Super NES. For anyone that had commented, we have over 40 people that entered, so I'm going to be doing a random see who wins today as soon as I get off the podcast. So please check out the Twitter community. It's really a cool place, and it's amazing to see the growth. And of course, all my socials are below. And you know that we're here every Saturday. We're going to be back, Kade, next Saturday too. We're going to have some cool guests. I will make an announcement next week. Want to thank everyone in chat. I see Mikey. I saw Retro Game Brews. I saw Video Game Restoration. I saw Biff Bluffington. I saw Al. I saw Commodore Chronicles. I saw you all. And I also especially want to let the VOD people know, thank you so much for listening on YouTube and watching us as well, and watching Kade P twice. That is a running theme. Kade.
Dude, you're never going to let me down for that. Damn it.
I know. No, I'm just messing. But Kade, thanks again, man. It's always a pleasure having a long, in-depth conversation with you about games, man. I could do this forever. We could talk for hours.
I know. I think we talked for 3 hours on my podcast.
We did. And, we got a little over on my podcast. Usually I go about an hour, but I would say it was worth it. And really appreciate it, man. I hope you have a great weekend, and want to let everyone know out there in the streaming verse or whatever VOD world, thank you so much for checking out the podcast. We'll be back. I'm Andy. That's Kade. And this is Cafe BTW, a morning gaming podcast. We'll see you all next week. Take care.
Bye-bye.